exams on Monday. They are mostly graded, all right, but I have to do a lot of grade imports yet, so not quite there. I just ran out of time. So we're going to start on a new unit and a new topic this week, right? And I'm excited about this because this is more of my field of expertise. All right, we're going to be talking, starting with evolutionary change here. So we're going to address that age-old question: where do we come from? All right, so that question has been asked many, many times over. Many ideas have existed. They might be based on religions, philosophy, science. All right, there's many answers to where do we come from. But being a science class, all right, we're going to talk about the theory of evolution. All right, so theory of evolution is based on empirical thought, meaning we are relying on observations to form an idea or a hypothesis. All right, so often you'll hear the term empirical data. All right, so in labs the previous weeks you have collected data, whether it might be absorbance values or CO2 levels. Whatever you collected that is based on an observation, you got a data point for that. That would be empirical data. All right, so in about the 1600s, all right, we started to have a shift towards empirical thought. All right, now this definitely was met with a lot of controversy, and it took a long time for empirical thought to catch on, right? But it started around the 1600s. Right, and this man here was very influential in especially the theory of evolution. So Charles Darwin, I am sure that you have heard his name before. All right, he wrote that very famous book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, and which led to our modern definition of evolution. All right, the change in allele frequency in a population over time. All right, so remember, alleles, they are underlying the traits that we see. All right, so genotype influences phenotype. We were talking about the change in allele frequency, which is the variations on your genotype in a population over time. All right, but there was a lot leading up to Darwin coming up with this hypothesis. All right, so there were some scientists before Darwin that kind of started to think about evolution. All right, so this man here, George Buffon, all right, he came up with the idea that populations of living things change over time. They're not static. All right, so if we found a fish in the ocean, let's see, 100 million years ago, it's probably going to look a little different than the fish in the ocean that we might see today. All right, that living things can change over time. However, this was a very controversial idea, and he actually hid his ideas in a 44-volume series of books. All right, so to figure out what he was actually saying, you had to read 44 books in a series on natural history. All right, again, it was a very controversial thought, so he kind of hid it away so it wouldn't be in the public eye so much. Right, we also have this other guy, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. All right, so he kind of popularized the idea that life on Earth evolves. All right, now he thought that life on Earth evolves because species change over generations by adapting to new environments by the use and disuse of body parts. All right, so he came up with this idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So his idea was that the behavior is going to change the traits that are passed along. All right. Remember, they didn't have any idea of like the genetic basis of genes at this point. All right. So we didn't know about alleles. So he came up with this idea that it was behavior based. All right. And a very good example of this is in giraffes. All right. So he proposed that these giraffes, in the furthest generation that you could think of, actually had pretty short necks. Maybe they looked a lot like horses. All right, but they had to stretch their necks to reach these leaves up on top of the tree. And it was that behavior of stretching their necks that led to this change down the line where eventually each generation had a longer and a longer neck. All right, so there was behavior that was influencing this. All right, we know that's not the case today, but this was very influential in kind of changing our mindset on how individuals in a population can change. All right, at the same time, there are some theories about these geological processes that we see in our world and how they came to exist. So one of them was catastrophism. All right, so this is the idea that the Earth is about 6,000 years old, and catastrophic events changed its geological structure. All right, so if we think about the Grand Canyon down here in the bottom, all right, the idea was that this Grand Canyon was less than 6,000 years old, and it took a huge catastrophic event to carve out this canyon in a matter of years. All right, so that was kind of the prevailing thought at the time. But we also have this thought that crept in about uniformitarianism. All right, so if you ever take a geology class, you will definitely come across this term again. And this is the hypothesis that slow geological processes lead to a substantial change. Right? So the Earth is much older than 6,000 years old because these processes that we are observing took thousands upon thousands of years to change. Right? So taking this example of the Grand Canyon again, it took millions of years for this water to slowly carve its way down through this canyon. All right, so we're really focusing this hypothesis on what we're observing around us today and applying them to what we know could have happened in the past. All right, so today we can walk out to a stream, we can see erosion happening, right? Much slower and smaller scale, but we know that water leads to erosion. All right, so we can apply that thought that we observe today into these different geological features that we can observe in the past. And James Hutton and Charles Lyell, I put their pictures up here, they're really the ones that came up with this idea and promoted this idea. All right, so there are a lot of theories kind of leading up to Darwin's famous voyage across the Earth at the time. So Darwin, he decided to go on the voyage of the Beagle in the early 1800s, and what he found is mostly what influenced his own observations. All right, now Darwin went on this voyage when he was 22 years old. So, I don't know about you, but when I was 22, and if you're thinking about when you turn 22, just saying, you know, bon voyage, I'm gone for 5 years on a ship, going to look at fossils and plants. All right, that's pretty huge. All right, that's very, very young. So he went on that 5-year voyage, age 22, and made all these important collections and discoveries. So traveling around the world, he collected thousands of plants, animals, fossils, right? Thousands upon thousands of specimens. And he noticed a few things. All right, so when he looked at fossils, he noticed that those that he found in South America, all right, looked more like the present-day South American species, all right, than the fossils he might have found in other continents like Australia or Africa. All right, these fossils did not look much like present-day South American species as the South American fossils did. All right, so he started to piece some ideas together here. All right, he noticed many different things. Most famous is what he noticed in the Galapagos Islands. All right, so he noticed distinctive traits of island species that allowed them to better exploit their environment. So a very common example to give here is the finches, often called Darwin's finches. And he noticed that these finches, they all were very similar, all right, but they had differences that allowed them to employ different feeding strategies. And he saw these differences in beaks. So if we look at our ground finches here, all right, their type of beak is to crush because they're eating a lot of seeds, all right, so they have more of these sturdy beaks to them. All right, if we look at the tree finches, their beaks are a little bit more delicate, all right, they're living on trees and they're feeding on bugs instead of seeds. So they have longer, slender beaks so they can reach into the bark and grab out those insects. All right, so all the finches look similar, but they have these different beaks that allowed them to adapt to a specific environment. All right, now we made other observations as well, such that organisms were similar to the mainland of South America. All right, so he might have noticed that the turtles he observed on the islands looked similar to the turtles that he found on the mainland. But he also noticed that island had species different from the other islands surrounding them. All right, so different islands had different species. And this led him to some pretty big conclusions. All right, so again, he collected thousands of specimens, and he came to the conclusion that the Earth is very old and is constantly changing. All right, so again, we look at these geological processes. Earth is very old, so it took a long time to carve out the Grand Canyon with erosion from a river, as well as create these mountain ranges by continental uplift. All right, so we really confirmed Hutton and Lyell's principles of geology, that these natural forces are slowly working on our Earth, and they're still operating today. All right, so I believe it's Mount Everest is still technically growing, if I remember the mountain range correct. I think it's Everest that still gets a little taller every year, very slowly, but a little taller. All right, now when he looked at the organisms, he came up with these theories, and he began to write about his theories. Now at the same time, there's another gentleman, Alfred Wallace, all right, that sent Darwin an unpublished manuscript proposing many of these same ideas. All right, so Darwin and Wallace actually published these papers around the same time, proposing the same kind of ideas. It wasn't until Darwin published On the Origin of Species that he really detailed out all these observations that he made on his trip. All right, so this book is very lengthy on his observations, gave a lot of support for this theory of evolution. Right? It also started a great debate. Right? Remember at the time, science and church are kind of at odds with each other. Right? So it started a great debate on this theory of evolution. But it's our foundation for understanding biology. All right, so he wrote his book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, published it in 1859. Used all of this evidence to come up with this idea of descent with modification. Right? So as ancestors or as descendants of an ancestor moved to a new environment, they adapted. Right? They accumulated these diverse modifications that helped them fit into the environment that they moved into. So the earlier generations look different from the later generations. So that's where we get the idea of natural selection. Right? That's kind of a brief history about how natural selection came about. So natural selection is a mechanism of a descent with modification, essentially what Charles Darwin was describing. And there's these 4 different postulates that he told us in his book of what needs to exist in order for natural selection to occur. All right, so if you've gone through lab this week, which being Friday, I think everybody has, all right, you probably contemplated upon these different ideas. The first being that more offspring are produced than can survive. All right, so not all that offspring is going to survive. Maybe it's just environmental factors that lead to their death. Maybe it's a certain trait that's detrimental, but not all of them are going to survive. We have phenotypic variation. All right, so what we're physically seeing on these organisms, there's variation in it. All right, so I'm using the example off to the side of these beetles that are differently colored. All right, so there's a lot of phenotypic variation. There has to be a fitness difference associated with that variation. All right, so in this case, color, if we look at color and we look at these successive generations, all right, we see that the color slowly changes. All right, so it looks like the colors that these beetles are darker tend to have a higher fitness. All right, so fitness is your ability to survive and make offspring. More offspring you have, the higher your fitness. All right, so these darker individuals had a higher fitness than, say, these light individuals. And we can pose a hypothesis that's probably due to their ability to blend into their background. Right? Their background habitat is very dark. Finally, we have to have heritability. All right, so we can't just have these traits. We have to be able to pass these traits down to our offspring. And we see that again with these 3 different successive generations. So I want to just kind of take a minute to talk about what is a population, because we've been saying this word quite a bit, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm going to use the example of the Joshua tree. I don't know if anyone's seen a Joshua tree here. I'm a big plant nerd. When I drove through this area, I was geeking out over these Joshua trees. All right, they only occur in this small range in the southwest of the United States here. That's kind of in this green color in the corner here. But if we look closely at this green color, right, it's very fragmented. They're not all in one area as a big blob. All right, we see that there's these different areas that they exist. There's different populations. All right, so it's the same species, but depending on where they are, there's a different population. And those populations could have similarities within each other, but different between the other population. So for example, this red population might have some trait that's just slightly different from the trait we might see in this southern green population. Right? And there's our Joshua tree here as well. All right, so some key points about natural selection. All right? Individuals do not evolve. All right? So a single individual is not going to evolve, but the population in which it lives in can. All right? So populations evolve. Individuals do not. All right, so if we look at this bug population over here, we have some insects that have a chromosome with an allele that gives them resistance to a pesticide. So if a farmer is spraying his field, these insects that have this allele with the resistance are more likely to survive. All right, they're surviving, which is great, all right, but it's their offspring that'll evolve. Right? Because their offspring will more than likely have a higher frequency of having that allele that has resistance. Now, this only works with heritable traits. Right? You must be able to pass these traits down to your offspring. If you can't pass these traits down to your offspring, then that trait's going to die out when you die out. Right? There's going to be no evolution occurring. And finally, there's no goal. Right? These insects did not come into this field and set out to have resistance to pesticide, right? That's just kind of how it happened. They just happened to have that allele that conferred resistance, right? It was by chance. There was no goal. There was no group thinking that some of us are going to survive, others are not because we want to develop this resistance. Not the case, right? These other insects, I'm sure they wanted to survive as well. So absolutely no goal. And depending on what environment we're looking at, a species could evolve different traits depending on the environment. Right? So think about individuals with differently colored fur. Right? I think the classic example is, I believe, the rabbit with the white fur and brown fur. If it lives in the snow-covered Arctic area, the white fur is probably going to be better versus if it lives in more of an area like here where it's nice and brown during the fall. All right, those brown-colored furs are probably going to do better down here. All right, so it totally depends on what environment you're living in. All right, so I want us to take a break and kind of think over these questions. What are some of those observations that Darwin made? On how did that provide empirical evidence to support natural selection? All right, and then there's finally another question I want you to answer after that. Take a couple minutes to do so. Yes.
What you're hearing is that I did better than a phone. And then he like went to the I was like, man, 2 in a row.
If you have to look at your exam for class, I have a couple minutes.
What was your office?
You have to know.
Corey has to know. So.
Depends how high they went up on the tree.
I need to know because I just took a major L in chemistry. Can I put it to you that way? I had a meeting with Molly after my lecture.
All right.
Okay, let's answer the first question.
I literally did.
Okay, no, it's not. Okay, but how is that? How is that empirical evidence that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's variation.
So Because Trevor lives in Eau Claire, and then I know like 17 people who live in Eau Claire.
And I went to go find Ella. And I was like, you know, they're to the town, they dropped me off early, like, this is time for that.
There was the
I took a lot.
That's where I live.
Oh.
I'm trying to get home.
And she just found my room. And she's like, oh, just wait till tomorrow. Oh, she just kept.
What happened there?
All right, have we had a chance to answer these questions?
Yeah.
All right, so what are some of Darwin's observations and how did that provide empirical evidence to support natural selection? What did he look at?
We looked at some benches and fossil records.
Yeah, he looked at fossils, right? And so we looked at fossils and noticed, oh, they're kind of similar to what we see today in areas that are similar to where the fossils are found. Right? What are some other types of evidence that he collected? He looked at beaks, yeah. So he noticed that different beaks, different traits in their beaks allowed them to survive in different habitats with different eating abilities. Anything else we can think of? Location, yeah. So he noticed that species were very similar to, say, if they were on an island, very similar to the closest landmass to that island. Anything else? Okay. He had a lot of evidence, right? Remember, he collected thousands of specimens. We're going to go through kind of some of the evidence that he collected specifically. All right, so our mechanism of evolution here is natural selection. Let's look at the evidence that kind of shows us that, yeah, natural selection is a part of evolution. All right, so the first being paleontology. All right, so paleontology, we are looking at the fossil record. And if we look at the fossil record, we can see the sequence in which the fossils appear within the layers or the strata of sedimentary rocks. All right, so sedimentary rocks are rocks that will build up over time and they can trap different organisms and fossilize them. And if we look at a fossil record, so we're looking at strata from older rock layers to younger rock layers, we see as we go into the younger rock layers, our fossils become more and more complex, all right, in general. All right, so that's one kind of type of evidence that we can have for natural selection is the fossil record. All right, but we also find specific fossils that kind of show us, oh, this might be what's commonly referred to as the missing link between a fossil that we have and a species that's living today. All right, so we call these transitional species. And a good example of this is these tetrapods. All right, so if we look at these tetrapods, all right, way back when here, all right, they very much look like an amphibian. All right, they had these legs, they had eyes on the top of their head, they had a flexible neck, they actually had a primitive wrist and 5 different fingers. All right, so we've seen this in our fossil record, right? We've also seen fish that are swimming around today, all right? But then we found this tetrapod, the Tiktaalik rosei, all right? So that's a species the name that they gave this species. They had a little bit of both, all right? We had scales, we had fins, all right? But we also had this flat head with the eyes on the top, all right? So it had features from both this old fossil record and what we see today, all right? So we can think of this as a very transitional species, all right? It might be a link in the evolutionary chain for this fish. All right, so moving away from the fossil record, we can also look at biogeography. Right, so when we say biogeography, we're talking about the geographic distribution of organisms. All right, so if we look at biogeography, we notice that just like what Darwin noticed, right, organisms that are found closer together tend to look more or less similar. All right, so a good example of this is the island fox, which lives on these islands outside of California here. It looks very similar to the mainland fox, the gray fox, right, that lives in California. It looks very similar, but yet they have different traits that have allowed this island fox to better evolve to these very specific environments. In fact, this island fox can only be found on these islands, and because it's only found in a particular location, we can say that this island fox is endemic. All right. If we look at this other example down here, if we look maybe at a broader scale of geography, we could say that this is a continent, and we have species A. All right. Now, say over time, this continent is going to break apart and start to drift apart. All right. Part of species A that was left on one half of the continent can evolve into species B. Maybe this half of the continent has a different environment. Right? So B is evolving to fit that environment a little bit more specifically. Right? If we say another millions of years have gone by, now we have these islands made out of the original continent. We still have species A, we still have species B, but in part of it, B has evolved into C. Again, it probably has a very specific environment in that chunk of continent that's left that we are evolving our traits to be better suited for. All right, another evidence that we can look at is convergent evolution. All right, so convergent evolution kind of suggests that we have adaptation to the environment. All right, so if we look at two different species from two different lineages, they might show similar characteristics. Right, so these species are not very closely related, but yet they have traits that look very similar because they occupy the same environment. All right, so if we look at the giant anteater and the, echidna? All right. Sure, let's go with it, echidna. All right, these two different animals here, all right, they're not very closely related, but they're living in the same environment, but they both have these long snouts to help them feed on ants. All right, they've individually evolved the same trait. We can also look at that with plants. So vining plants are a good example. These plants are not closely related, but they live in a similar type of environment where they might want to grow up to reach the sunlight per se. All right, so they have these aerial roots and they have these very viney stems that allow them to grow up. So these similar characteristics that we observe between different species are called analogous structures. All right, so that long snout or the very viney stems would be analogous structures. All right, there's a lot of examples of convergent evolution. So I want you to take out your phones, take out your computers, and try to find some other examples other than those that I just gave to you.
Rita, you strike me as the Adele type. Do you like Adele?
Nah, she's okay. I think it's
She's
talented,
talented,
but
but
I
her
don't
new
like her.
album is
Yeah.
so good.
When she came out, her songs are really good, but she just got so overplayed. I got bored.
But the
snaps
songs-
that. Yeah.
These songs are kind of like the old
All of
ones.
his animals have like before.
Yeah. Like 19 and 21, they're kind of like. Yeah, there's like a voiceover where she's talking to her son on the divorce.
Whoa.
My bad, her daughter.
All right, so let's think about.
Okay,
Yeah.
I have a question. It's like families, for an example of like families as in like taxonomy.
Okay. Okay.
You know what I mean? Like so like they're all kind of in the same family.
What's
Is
that?
that an example of evolution because they're all like the same kind of like thing? Like so like a family of like certain subfigures.
Right.
What do you?
Or like a family of like reptiles.
This is my new favorite thing to look at.
Entire like they're all
Yes.
have the same.
I mean,
Or is
they're
it
not
more like
they're
they have
closely related.
I'm not the only one.
They probably all evolved from something common that had these traits.
Yeah.
But if you say look at a family of cacti that's further apart, and the biology way over there, but maybe they're both here.
Okay, got it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So they have to be kind of like different in terms of like from biological is
Yeah.
okay, that makes sense. Got it.
What are you?
They're in the same place.
That's so sad.
Imagine if the audience like now brought up made it to that. But I feel like this structure we go with
Alright, so this should not have taken too long to do some quick Googling. So what are some other examples of convergent evolution? A lot of them out there. Yeah.
back in the old
Yeah, echolocation, whales versus bats, right? Totally different species, but similar traits evolved to find food. Alright, anything else? I know there's other ones out there. Yeah.
Sharks and dolphins have like create and ichthyosaurs have the similar like pectoral fins and body shapes for like moving and swimming.
Yeah, totally. So think about dolphins and sharks, they all have very similar body shapes in response to the environment that they're living in. That way it allows them to swim. And probably, I'm guessing in this case, swim a little faster is what my guess would be. Alright, another example. Anyone else?
I have one in my head, but I don't
Yeah.
know how to word it.
Crustaceans keep evolving into crabs.
Crustaceans what?
Keep evolving into crabs or crab-like species.
Yeah, crustaceans that keep evolving into a crab-like species. Alright, so there must be something advantage of looking like a crab that gives them an advantage in the environment. Nice. Anything else we want to mention? Yeah.
Specific one. Anteaters and penguins are very similar in how they walk, and they have these enormous claws to break open termite towers that are as hard as concrete.
There we go. All right. Having claws that break open termite towers. All right. Again, different species, but same trait evolved to help them
I think I
eat
got the
these
words.
termites. You have the words? All right. Let's hear it.
I think I do. So like cows and horses both stand while they're sleeping. I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Oh, I'm being informed that cows don't. Never mind.
Huh? That's why you can tip them over.
I'm not sure if both cows and horses stand while they're sleeping, but if they did,
If they did, you know.
yeah, totally.
Very good. Good.
All right. So, great examples of convergent evolution here. All right. So, let's move on to some other empirical evidence for natural selection. So, we're going to move on. I'm going to encourage you to save your discussion for our next point here. All right. But we're going to talk about selective breeding. All right. So, this is a form of evidence for natural selection, but it's artificial selection. All right, it didn't happen naturally. It has a goal to it, and that goal is whatever phenotype an individual finds desirable. All right, so I can't think of any other example besides humans that are involved in artificial selection, all right? Artificial selection of other species. So dogs, great example, all right? They all descended from the wolf, but over time, individuals found different traits desirable, and they selected specifically for those traits. All right, so it's made possible by having genetic variation, by having those alleles that have these variants of a gene that we can select for. Right, now personally, I am a big fan of the wiener dog. I think they're cute and adorable with their stubby little legs.
You have a dog.
I do not have a dog. I will someday, I'm sure. I have a cat for now. Darwin also saw artificial selection back in his day, right? So this is not a new thing that's happening. He could look at different homing pigeons and find traits that were desirable by different breeders, as well as in food. All right, so wild mustard has been artificially bred for all sorts of different vegetables that we eat today, such as kale, broccoli, and cabbage. All right, so there's a lot of evidence that we can select for variation to get some sort of an outcome. Now, in this case, it was very deliberate. In terms of natural selection, it's not deliberate at all. It just happens. All right, the last type of feature that we're going to look at that kind of gives you evidence of natural selection is homology. All right, so fundamental similarities due to descent from a common ancestor. All right, so homology might be anatomical in a structure that we're looking at. It might be developmental or molecular. All right, specifically now that we have advances in technology, we see molecular homology a lot more now. All right, but if we start with anatomical homology, all right, we have these homologous structures. Now this word homologous should sound very similar to you. All right, so when we talked about mitosis and meiosis, we talked about homologous pairs. All right, in that they were very similar because they encoded the same type of information, but they had slight differences to it. All right, we can apply that same type of logic to homologous structures. All right, they are similar to one another. We look at these bones, they've been color-coded to show that all these different species, humans, turtles, bats, and whales, have similar bones, all right, but they're very different in how they're presented, all right, due to adaptations to specific environment. All right, so they have a similar ancestry to them. All right, we see vestigial structures and some organisms as part of these anatomical structures that we can use to give evidence for natural selection. So vestigial structures are anatomical structures that have no apparent function. All right, so an example that I put up here is the human coccyx. All right, that has really no function to it, right? But it's there. Right? And it's probably there because it's left over from evolution from our ancestors. All right, we don't need a tail anymore. So there's no reason that we need to grow a tail, but there's some leftover bits of that tail. All right, so they resemble structures of presumed ancestors. And there's a lot of examples of vestigial structures out there. So if we look at snakes, they actually have the skeletal remains of hip and hind leg bones. All right, so presumably their ancestors had legs and were able to walk. All right, so that was anatomical homology. Let's talk about developmental homology. All right, and so when we talk about developmental homology, we're talking about before an organism is born. All right, so we're revealing homologies that are not visible in adult organisms, but we can see them in their embryonic form. All right, so a good example of embryonic homology, also called comparative embryology, all right, are gills. All right, we see gills in chickens, in humans, and in cats when we're in the embryonic stage. Now, obviously, we don't have gills now, all right? They go away before we are born, but early in development, they are there. They exist, suggesting that we all had a common ancestor that had gills. Same with tails. All right, we see tails in a cat, a human, and a chick. Right? In humans, we lose that tail before we are born. All right, the last type of homology is genetic homology. And we've seen a lot of advances of this in recent years. But we can compare DNA and amino acid sequence between different organisms. All right, and what we are seeing is that all life forms are related. Right, we all have DNA. All right, and we're all encoding for these proteins. The DNA code for proteins found in living cells can be very similar between different species. All right, even humans and bacteria. All right, we're vastly different nowadays, but somewhere way back when we had a common ancestor because we can see we have homologous genes that were inherited in both humans and bacteria. All right, so I just threw up this image here that we can see a human and a fruit fly. If we look at the amino acid sequence for this gene, right, there's very few differences. In fact, we're 90% similar to a fruit fly for this particular gene. All right, so that's a great evidence that gives the idea that we're all connected in some way, and natural selection just works upon different traits to evolve different populations. All right, I want you to kind of think about those different homologies. Say them out loud with one another, make sure you have them down, and then find an example of each that's different from what I gave you in class. Again, you can Google whatever you need to do to find that example.
Vestigial. I said vegetable. It's not vegetable. It's not saying
Okay, the
vegetable, it's saying
appendix of
vestigial.
humans, but that can also be, people argue that it's not It's still used for some. Yeah.
This one just says my little brother. So here you have like a complete
Wow.
Because that's a type of like evolution.
Yeah, it means that we're all like how we have an appendix. We don't need one because back in the day, mammals needed it because they were eating on. What's it called? Digestion. But we, because
That's because now we eat like Twinkies.
well, that's true. And we don't need to, we don't need to ferment it.
Yeah, that would mean throwing up all the time.
Is it important to memorize?
You know that the ideas that led up to natural selection coming out, like
Anything that's on the body.
What would be another molecular? Four limbs of whales, humans, birds,
The migraine thing is.
but that's.
Yeah. She smacked her head on the I think that's what it is, but she's just standing up forever. Speaking of
yeah, I know.
Oh,
That's so funny.
I love I have animal right outside my Here, wait, let me show you. I did like this cute little thing where I arranged them in size order because you took a video of the hind limbs of the side.
So all these old guys in this presentation, add them to my people who I think are in red list.
Yeah, maybe that's how they learned about genetics. I think that they learned about their history.
Did you see what Harvard's right? I'm very good. I'm very good at observation.
I would get to the point where you're not
Also, I have another person. I'll share another person today.
What?
I've been thinking this ever since you've been in media. I made a very good point. Also, people that I think are inbred have
All right, so what is one type of homology?
vegetable.
Vestigial, which is part of what type of homology?
Anatomical.
Anatomical.
Yeah.
All right. So we're looking at structures. What might be an example of an anatomical homology?
The appendix.
It could be the appendix. All right, that one's a little less obvious because we're still producing it. I think there's areas that it's used for something, but we don't quite know. But basically, it's still there and it doesn't have an obvious function. All right, what's another example?
Tonsils one. Like, people get their tonsils taken out.
Potentially.
That is true. I don't have one. They just cause problems.
Yeah. Any other examples? All right, what's the next homology?
Molecular.
Molecular. What's an example of a molecular homology?
We're like 55%
No idea.
similar to bananas or something like that.
Yes. I have heard a lot of statistics like that were X amount similar to some random other organism. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I'd have to do some Googling myself, but that would be an example. What's the last type of homology? Developmental, yeah. What's an example of that?
They all look like lizards.
All right, yeah. So snakes, they don't actually develop the legs. They might have some vestigial structures, but as an embryo, they have legs. All right, that's a good example of developmental. All right. Before you leave today, there is quiz 5 on Monday. It is only on this lecture. All right. So there's only 5 points, 5 questions, only on this lecture.
I have another really good one. Guys have nipples. I can hear you.